Uh, Let me just introduce our speaker tonight. It's Paul Browne, who has, I don't know if this is his third time with us or second time with us, but Paul has been very active in various 19th century committee activities, addressing the Fred, articles in the newsletter, articles in the various SABR publications, lots of 19th century research on very, very different topics, very eclectic set of items that he studies. And tonight, he have a profile of hustling, let me get to Dan O'Leary. I was about to say hustling Horace Phillips because Bill Ryzak gave that talk at the Fred a year ago. There may be several hustling guys, and we'll learn out why that nickname was applied to a lot of people. But Paul, if you'd like to bring your slides up now, if you'll hit screen share, we'll get this show on the road.
Okay. I'm looking for screen share. Give me a hint of where.
To run your cursor to the bottom, there's a green icon that says share screen.
Okay, hold on a second here. I got to shrink these and get back to Zoom. Sorry, technological issues here. Okay, here we go. Exit minimize video. All right, we'll try that. And down here we got share screen. Okay, thank you.
And then the dialog box will come up, and you'll see the title of your slides will come up in there. Just click on those.
Okay, actually, I'm getting a notice that host disabled participant screen sharing.
I did not. Hold on. I'll fix everything. All right, let's try this again. All right, did you see the co-host note?
I did not.
Okay, okay. Well, you're showing up on my screen as a code. If you
shall I try share screen again?
Yeah, give it a try. Click that and see if it shows the dialog box.
There we go.
Okay. Click on yours, and we should start to see as it loads.
My computer is slow tonight. I apologize for that.
Well, it's still getting over the hour. It lost sleep this last Saturday.
Okay, and I can get to slideshow here.
It'll start coming up. Now, all you gotta do is if you go down to the bottom, there's a red line along the bottom with icons over to the right. Before you get to the little slide bar, there's a square with a little plus underneath it. Click that and you go to the full screen and you're ready to go.
Okay. I'm seeing. Okay, should I be in my PowerPoint view or in the Zoom view?
It should be in PowerPoint. You should have your Hustling Dan O'Leary splash screen, and then over on the left you'll have those little thumbnails.
Right.
And if you run your cursor to the bottom, there's a red line. I don't know if the color is different, and just run it over toward the right. And just before you get to the plus minus slide bar, there's a little icon, which is a square with a little plus underneath it. Click that and you'll go to full screen. That's it. Yeah,
okay.
Now you're
all right.
And if everybody
wants,
yeah, you're ready to go. If you move, if the audience will look up in the upper right hand corner is the view button. If you click that and go to side by side speaker, all you'll get is Paul's thumbnail on to the right and the screen the main slide screen. So Paul, you're ready to start.
Okay. If God had not created hustling Dan O'Leary, Damon Runyon would have. O'Leary is not well known today, but he was well appreciated by the sports writers of his time, as he was usually involved in something that would make an amusing story. He danced on the edge of fame and infamy, and even the national game, one of baseball's earliest histories, couldn't resist telling a tale on Dan, attributed to player, manager, and later sports writer Sam Crane. The gist of this story is that while managing in Scranton, O'Leary motivated his players by betting the payroll on a game. If they won, they would get their pay plus dinner and free drinks all night. But if they lost, it's almost needless to say his team played one of the best games ever and slaughtered their opposition. Daniel O'Leary was born on October 22nd, 1856 in Detroit, Michigan, and he died in Chicago, Illinois at the age of 69 in 1922. You do the math. These facts, like so many things about Dan O'Leary, are of questionable reliability. This may be because they came from a very questionable source, Hustling Dan himself. Never at a loss for a story, an angle, or a scheme, O'Leary claimed to be involved in some way in many of the important events that occurred in his lifetime. O'Leary is reputed to have come to Chicago with the Detroit Fire Department to fight the Chicago Fire of 1871, remaining in that city afterwards. While it is not impossible that a fireman of this area could have been as young as 15, it seems more likely that he would have been 18, at least, lending some credibility to an 1853 birth date. He may have claimed to be younger at some time, very possibly to further his baseball career. Detroit Engine Companies 3 and 6 traveled with their fire engines by train to the Chicago fire. Their rigs were stuck on trains outside of town, and there is some question if they were actually able to reach the fire without their equipment. The Detroit Historical Society has an 1871 picture of Engine Company 6 with its members identified. O'Leary is not among them. The Historical Society also has an 1871 picture of Engine Company 3, but none of the members are identified. This is the picture of Engine Company 3. Comparing this picture to a newspaper drawing of O'Leary that accompanies his obituary and his height and weight statistics at baseballreference.com, there is a member of Engine 3 who may well be O'Leary. It's the third guy from the left. That's my guess, and it's purely a guess with very limited information, but it's possible. And if this is Dan, he appears to be at least 18 years old at the time. O'Leary's first recorded baseball activity was the Cass Club of Detroit in 1876. The following year, he was elected president of the club and also expected to play catcher. This indicates his skill and ambitions were at least as much as an administrator as a player. Like many early players of this era, he bounced from team to team, league to league, playing level to playing level, and geographic region to geographic region, with the most ambitious ending up on the East Coast, with New York City being the primary gravitational pull. O'Leary soon found his way east and caught on with Lynn of the International Association. He would play with this team in April and May. His next stop was with Lowell, also of the IA, where he played between June 4th and June 6th. He then played with Manchester, another IA team, from June 7th to August 23rd. O'Leary's talent for obtaining publicity showed itself while with Manchester. The Washington Post of July 8, 1878 reported that Dan had played in 13 games, had 19 base hits, 17 putouts, 3 assists, 5 runs, was left on base 10 times, and had not had an error until his 13th game. Quite a lot of coverage in a distant city for a player with limited tenure with any team. Dan returned to Lowell in August, where he played to the end of the season in October. In 1887, Charles Curry Foley, a fellow Lowell player, would tell a tale on Dan's Lowell days. On a trip through New York State, O'Leary had been playing poorly. Desperate, Dan asked his roommate Foley to kneel down and pray with him before they left their hotel room for the park in Utica. After rising, Dad said, "Charlie, it is about time our hard luck should change." He and Foley's luck did change, and Foley recorded the following conversation O'Leary had with himself on the walk home from the park. "It is a big mistake for anyone to think that Dan O'Leary can play ball a little, ain't it? Oh yes, oh yes. Dan O'Leary couldn't hit a flock of geese with a shotgun, could he? Oh no, oh no. It takes them fellows from Sebastopol or the town of Dungaree to hit the ball. But Dan O'Leary couldn't hit a big balloon, could he? Oh no, oh no. My cabasser is out of a joint, and I am away on my blooming chump, ain't I, Charlie? Oh yes, oh yes." He continued on to cover his own qualities as a good Catholic, Paul Hines' hearing, singing the Irish washerwoman on top of the Washington Monument, Spike Brady as a hitter, Brady's complaints about Chadwick, Taylor as a pitcher, and Anson's fighting for his men, and a suggestion that Anson be used to protect American fishermen who were complaining of a lack of protection by the U.S. government in foreign waters, etc., etc. Arriving back at their room, O'Leary said, "Charlie, infidels and sacrilegious people can talk as they like, but I tell you, me old Bartatara, that God is good to the Irish after all." Dan pointed to the bed and they knelt down to pray again. Dan O'Leary would make his debut in a now recognized Major League on September 3rd, 1879, with the National League Providence Grays. Much of O'Leary's career would consist of playing less than 10 games for the teams he worked for. His players were frequently required to collect tickets and perform other such functions. At this time, O'Leary may have already been showing his skills in the business side of baseball during his playing days. Dan's career consisted mostly of hooking on with high minor to major league teams, playing in a few games, and involved in some administrative functions. His primary talent seemed to have been in promoting his own reputation, or in modern terms, his brand. One of his famous teammates in Detroit was Ned Hanlon, who, like O'Leary, shared a name with a famous athlete of the period. Dan O'Leary, the pedestrian, was a famous race walker in the 19th century when such races were very popular. He's also one of the reasons it took me over 3 years to write a rather brief biography of O'Leary for the Bio Project because of constant confusion in searches. I also developed some resentment for James Gillespie Blaine when I was searching my first bio of Pete Gillespie. Edward Ned Hanlon was a Canadian who may have been the greatest individual sculler of all time. He began his career in 1874 and became the world's professional rowing champion in London in 1880. In 1884, R. Dan bragged that he bought Hanlon his first shell at an undisclosed time when Dan claimed to be managing a Toronto team. Hanlon was around a good deal with the boys, Dan said, and was always talking about rowing. He was a poor young fellow and had no money, but was constantly saying, "You mark my word, I'll beat them all someday." Finally, O'Leary and some others started a paper and raised enough to buy the ragged but ambitious young Ned a shell. Since there is no record of Dan's involvement in baseball before 1876, it's unlikely that he had been managing Canadian baseball teams and buying equipment for young athletes in 1874. Bill Humber is prepared to debunk my entire debunking of this incident after I'm done with the presentation. Hustling Dan moved on to club management at a relatively young age, no matter what birth date we use. In 1883, he was managing an independent Indianapolis team, sometimes known as the Indians. O'Leary was able to recruit some former and future major leaguers to this team, showing some scouting skills. Future Hall of Famer Sam Thompson was an O'Leary discovery. According to information collected by the Thompson family, Indianapolis was to play Danville, and the mayor of that town told O'Leary that his team could beat Dan's if Farmer Thompson could play for the home team. Interested in discovering a new talent, Dan rented a rig, and he and the mayor went out to find Thompson. Sam said he'd like to play, but he needed the $2.50 he was being paid for roofing. Dan paid Thompson $5 to play ball instead, and Danville beat O'Leary's team, which he recalled in discussing this event. Dan would claim that he then signed Thompson to play with Indianapolis, and the next year, Detroit acquired Thompson. Existing records show that Thompson went to Evansville in 1884 and was purchased by Indianapolis at the end of the '84 season, and then went to Detroit in June of '85. Dan may have had made the purchase from Evansville. In 1884, O'Leary's successful Indianapolis team would move up to the American Association. In this era, teams, not just individuals, players, rather frequently moved up in status. Dan's habit of vocal disputes with team owners left him sidelined, and he was released from his job before the 1884 season started. Dan was fortunate that a third major league, the Union Association, was formed in 1884. A team that became known as the Cincinnati Outlaw Reds hired O'Leary as manager. While this team started the season fairly strongly, they stalled, and Sam Crane was named as Dan's replacement. O'Leary was criticized for not instilling team discipline, and in fact was known for drinking with his players and betting on their games. In later life, O'Leary would claim to have had a hand in the end game of the UA by going over to the Cleveland club of the National League and taking some stars with him. That's at least an exaggeration. Despite his previous failure, he would be managing Toledo of the Western League in 1885, although this team would disband early that season. He returned to his home in Detroit after the Toledo club ceased operations, lamenting that there was nothing left of the Toledo club save the debts. They are more substantial than ever. Sunk $8,000 on the season, best season I ever saw for losing money. Had a nice time in Toledo, town very attached to me. There was an attachment waiting for me on every corner. Despite reports that he had died after leaving Toledo, most guys would have been honest about a thing like that, but Dan probably had his reasons. In the later part of March 1886, O'Leary was in Elmira, New York, bearing plans for a professional baseball club. All the citizens had to do was raise $2,500 for stock in the team, and O'Leary promised to buy 500 of those shares. Early efforts to sell stock resulted in a number of subscriptions being taken, and even some of the stock being paid for in cash. With these funds, O'Leary headed to New York City in mid-April to hire players. Although it was late in the season to be organizing a baseball team, O'Leary was quite successful in signing impressive players for a small city team. Among the more familiar names on the team were Frank Devin, Eddie Kennedy, Grayson S. Gracie Pierce, and John Dasher Troy. Devin pitched for Baltimore of the American Association in 1883 and would finish 1886 with New York of the National League. Kennedy was one of the original independent Metropolitans of 1980 and stayed with the team through their move to the AA in 1883 until his joining Elmira in 1886. He would return to the majors at the end of the 1886 season with Brooklyn of the American Association. Pierce had spent time with Louisville, Baltimore, and Columbus of the AA, went over to New York of the National League, and then returned to the American with the New York Metropolitans in 1884. Troy played with Detroit, Providence, and New York of the National League before joining the Metropolitans for 1884 and 1885. The easy availability of so many players from the Metropolitans may have been in part due to speculation between the 1885 and 86 seasons that the American Association was going to boot the Metropolitans due to problems with John B. Day's ownership of both the NL and AA New York franchises. In Pennsylvania, the Williamsport Grit reported that local people were promoting the formation of a Pennsylvania State Association. On April 28th, it would be cheerfully reported in Elmira that O'Leary had secured the Scranton franchise of this league. By May 5th, the Scranton area was under the impression that the Elmira team had been moved to Scranton. In Elmira, they were under the impression that the Elmira team was only playing under the Scranton name in Pennsylvania, and that O'Leary would soon develop a separate Scranton team, and their Elmira would return to playing exclusively for their city. O'Leary explained the need to sign the players to contracts under the Scranton name as a necessity because any player who broke a state league contract could be blacklisted, while the independent status of Elmira left him without such protection. Athletic Park in Wilkes-Barre was the site of, on May 11, 1886, of Wilkes-Barre's long-awaited for game against O'Leary's team. The picture here is of Charles Stegmeyer. His son George was a leading figure and owner of the Wilkes-Barre team in the 1886 Pennsylvania State Association. It was common for the up-and-coming next generation of business leaders to be active in the local teams of their communities, big or small. It was part of the boosterism to promote your town as an up-and-coming city during this period. Boards of trade, which would later morph into chambers of commerce, were part of these efforts. The Stegmeyer Brewery continues to be operational today, and I think this tray is from 1959. It's cold and it's gold like a Pocono spring in the summertime. So ring-a-ding-ding to the Stegmeyer thing anytime at all. I remember that from my youth. It's a horrible beer, by the way. Back to baseball. O'Leary's team was referred to alternately as Elmira Scranton, and the O'Learys. For good measure, they were also sometimes referred to as the Indians, a reference to the number of former American Association New York Metropolitan players on O'Leary's team. The Metropolitans being also known as the Indians from time to time. It was also linked to O'Leary's Indianapolis team, which was also known as the Indians. Attendance to Scranton size was about 1,000. To Wilkes-Barre, it was between 1,500 and 1,800. The Scranton Reporter did indicate that it was a standing room only crowd in any case, and suggested the new park being planned for Scranton should be close to the center of the city and be able to hold between 3,000 and 5,000 people. The reporter for the Wilkes-Barre Union Leader grudgingly admitted that O'Leary's team won the game. There were, however, a number of explanations for this sad fact. Wilkes-Barre was playing in its first game while the team representing Scranton had been playing for 3 weeks in Elmira. A new player, Lewis Renner, one of 3 recruited by Wilkes-Barre management to beef up the squad after they had seen O'Leary's boys play in Elmira, broke his finger while making a play at third base. In the tradition of the day, he was moved to the outfield rather than being taken from the game, the injury apparently not being deemed serious enough to require a substitute. In the outfield, Renner would be credited with making 2 good plays. The final reason for defeat was placed at the feet of Nort Marshall. While admitting that there were not many close decisions, this umpire was accused of giving all close calls to Scranton, including a play at third base where Slocum of the Wilkes-Barre slipped off third after a strong hit. The Wilkes-Barre reporter also lamented the loss of a home run by Slocum when the ball went over the fence and he was limited to a double. This is an unusual situation for the time, but may be a sign of evolving rules. In 1888, a rule would be put in place making it a double rather than a home run if the fence was less than 210 feet from home plate. Starting in the early 1860s and up to the 1888 rule change, any ball hit over any fence at any distance was ruled a home run. Special ground rules must have been in place at the Wilkes-Barre field. The pennant race for the 1886 Pennsylvania State Association would be between Wilkes-Barre and O'Leary's Scranton team. It would be fought out on the field, in the newspapers, and in association meetings. O'Leary would skirt the rules and inject himself into league politics. Wilkes-Barre would complain about almost any loss to its nearby rivals and raise protests with the association office on numerous occasions. During mid-May, O'Leary pressured Scranton area supporters to provide his team with adequate playing grounds. He whetted the appetite of the Scranton fans with the thing they desired most, a series of victories over Wilkes-Barre. O'Leary's team was seen as so superior to their main Pennsylvania State Association rival that Wilkes-Barre would have to recruit a whole new team to hope to match it. The Elmira papers reported these games, although what was called the Scranton team in Pennsylvania was referred to as the Elmira team in New York. It was also reported in Scranton and Elmira that the team would play their next 3 games in the New York community. Scranton fans were reassured that as soon as suitable grounds were provided, the team would play in its league championship games in the Pennsylvania city. This is Athletic Field off Providence Road in Scranton. A columnist from the Scranton Republican, writing under the rather clever pen name Amerigo Rounder, began to report on the relationship between Scranton and O'Leary. He made the claim that O'Leary had only pursued the Scranton franchise in the Pennsylvania State Association after he was unable to secure a spot in the New York State Association. While this might have been the case, this effort was never discussed in the Elmira press, at least that I could find. Wilkes-Barre and Scranton were competing for advantage on and off the field in mid-May. On Saturday the 15th, Wilkes-Barre refused to travel to Elmira to play the O'Leary Nine. O'Leary had promised 40% of the gate as an inducement for Wilkes-Barre to play in the New York City, but reneged when the Pennsylvania team arrived, offering only the $45 association guarantee instead. Wilkes-Barre refused to play the Saturday game and returned home Friday night. Lancaster also refused to play in Elmira. The Wilkes-Barre press claimed that O'Leary's players were not legally signed to association contracts, had not secured grounds in Scranton, and called on him to live up to the rules or the association to cease to recognize his team as a member. On May 24th, O'Leary's first monthly financial statement to his Elmira backers was hailed as an example of good management, and the local citizens were told the success of their team rested solely on their willingness to support it. Probably would have been easier to do if they had traveled to Scranton to support it, but that's beside the point. At the end of May, O'Leary secured grounds off Providence Road in Scranton from the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad that he planned to fit out as a ball field. Being in coal country, a frequently commented on feature of this field would be a calm pile from which non-playing or paying spectators would view games. Calm is a waste product of coal production, and there's huge piles of it to this day in my section of Northeast Pennsylvania. The Scranton team was doing well in the state league, and O'Leary expressed his opinion that the locals should support his efforts to develop a ballpark in order that his team might bring them a pennant. The local press supported him in this position. Meanwhile, back in New York, this team was still referred to as the Elmiras, but the inability of being able to identify the next date on which they would play in that city was beginning to become a concern. Despite this, O'Leary's Elmira supporters expressed their thanks to Scranton for providing another source of income and support for O'Leary's efforts so the manager's undertaking might be profitable, a shared team apparently being preferred to no team. The first game on the new Scranton field took place on June 8, 1886. Scranton beat Lewiston 16-5. 2,000 people reported in attendance. Improvement for the grounds were recommended so the balls would not go down into the Lackawanna River or the diamond mine. There are no diamonds being mined in Scranton. That's just the name of a nearby coal mine. The Scranton people were basking in their series lead over Wilkes-Barre, but the local press was beginning to complain of a lack of accommodations for them to comfortably report on games. The term O'Leary's Indians was also beginning to be used in Pennsylvania to identify the team, similar to the way the Elmira press began to distance the community from the team. Excuse me. A bright spot of the period was the naming by the Grit of an all-star team based on batting that included 5 Scranton players. They were Bagley at catcher, Helfer at first, Troy at second, Waters and Brill in the outfield. The good team O'Leary had promised both cities was there, but some of the manager's practices were beginning to wear thin, with players, stockholders, and fans on both sides of the state border. O'Leary's need for funds was the reason given for a 4th of July weekend, which included an exhibition game in Wilkes-Barre on Saturday, 2 games in the Brooklyn area on Sunday, a train trip from there back to Scranton, another train trip and a game in Wilkes-Barre on Monday morning, and a return trip to Scranton and another game with Wilkes-Barre in the afternoon. When both championship games with Wilkes-Barre were lost, Scranton fans felt misused, and Troy, Kennedy, and Devon demanded their release, which they were granted. Helfer also tried to resign, but O'Leary refused his request. O'Leary blamed the Scranton club's directors for his problems with his players, making a bad situation worse and leading to the president of the club calling the manager a liar in print. The situation diffused somewhat when Troy and Kennedy changed their minds and returned to the team. Criticism surrounding this incident was strong in both cities, but Elmira's feelings against O'Leary were expressed more bitterly in local coverage. By July 11th, the statement was printed: Elmira no longer has a ball club. The team continued to win games, but was struggling. Criticism of team discipline and the condition of the players began to circulate more regularly. On July 24th, the roof caved in on O'Leary. He could pay neither his room and office rent nor his players, and the landlord seized the bats and other available assets of the club. The Scranton Club directors dismissed O'Leary, and the O'Learys disbanded. To add insult to injury, the chain of events was set in motion when O'Leary's longtime ally, Dave Wheeler, entered a judgment for $225.50 for back pay for services rendered. The Scranton directors announced that they would attempt to form a new team and have it admitted to the Pennsylvania State Association with credit for the previous club's record. O'Leary's exit was celebrated with both prose and poetry in the Scranton press. The Republican publishing "The Hustler's Gone." The hustlers gone who once to Scranton came, like knights of old, intent on deeds of fame. With railroad magnets wrestled from the sting of curt refusal, a good lease did ring, a local habitation and a name. Not only was the championship his aim, for with great league clubs we had been promised game, but from his coat the rose has taken wing, the hustler's gone. Not with the band of music and the flame of torches and crackers roar and the acclaim of men as when from Wilkes-Barre he did bring his nine triumphant and the praises sing. Ah no, no more will hear O'Leary's name, the hustler's gone. They printed a lot of poetry in 19th century sports and early 20th century sports pages. They didn't all have to be good. The Scranton directors were successful in getting the state association to accept the new team they formed without O'Leary and allow it to pick up where the old team left off. Sam Crane would become manager of the Scranton team in 1888, following O'Leary as he had in Cincinnati, although not as quickly. It took almost 2 years. The Elmira Telegram of August 1st printed a scathing yet accurate article regarding O'Leary's adventures in Scranton and Elmira. The paper took a bow for its earlier warnings against O'Leary. It also reported that O'Leary and his assistant in this adventure, Dave Wheeler, had a set-to with a woman of fairy reputation who assaulted both men. And the nearest I could come to a definition of a woman with fairy reputation was she was basically nuts. And to get involved with those two guys probably proves it. On August 22nd, reports began to appear of O'Leary's arrest in New York City on a warrant sworn out by an Elmira landlord. O'Leary was brought back to Elmira to settle the debt after failing to raise the needed funds from his city friends. The reluctant landlord accepted $40, his watch and overcoat from O'Leary after it became apparent that other Elmira creditors with superior lien positions were about to secure warrants for O'Leary. The hustler was left enough money for train fare to New York City and left the upstate community in a hurry. After the Elmira Scranton fiasco, O'Leary was expected to be managing in New Orleans in 1887. This would turn out to be a theatrical troupe. As Dan was frequently at liberty during the baseball season, his theatrical adventures may have sustained him during and after the season. Also during 1887, he would arrange a benefit for the Irish Land League. It did not have the desired results, and Dan complained, "So help me, Ginger, if you would have fired a Gatling gun through the house that night, you wouldn't have hit a Finian." He would later in life continue to frequent the theater and advise other theatrical managers with both wanted and unwanted advice. By the end of that year, O'Leary would return to Chicago and settle into his long-term career as a freelance police reporter. He would also maintain a strong connection to baseball alumni associations, and his political skills frequently had him included in lists among players and managers whose skill levels far exceeded Dan's. He was active long enough to weigh in on the 1919 Black Sox scandal. On October 5th, 1920, the Chicago Daily Tribune reported that standing outside the grand jury room where the Black Sox trial was being held, O'Leary said the players can throw away their shoes and they know it. Dan became noted in Chicago and eventually nationally for wearing a carnation in his lapel. Dan wore the carnation in memory of a sister who had died. The sister had taken care of his widowed mother, and Dan had taken care of them financially. They remained in Detroit, and B.F. Wright would tell a characteristic story about Dan related to this relationship. In his earlier days, Dan had lost at the races while visiting Detroit, needed a loan from his sister. Going to the bank to cash her check, a teller asked Dan for identification. Dan responded, "By the jump up, holy Judas Iscariot, is there a man in Detroit who don't know Dan O'Leary?" The teller at the adjoining window responded, "I never saw him in my life, but that's Dan, all right." Dan would be one of the early members of Chicago's long-lived Old Timers Baseball Association, participating in reunions alongside the likes of Anson, Pfeffer, and Al Spink. At the time of Anson's death in April 1922, O'Leary would be listed along with Tom Foley and Frank Kiefer as the association's representatives at the funeral service. Dan would not last long after Anson. In mid-June of 1922, articles would begin to appear about O'Leary's hospitalizations with heart problems. On June 24th, he would succumb to gastritis complicated by heart weakness at St. Joseph's Hospital in Chicago. His pallbearers would be newspapermen he had worked with, and his estate, consisting of $600 in personal items, would be handled by Tribune reporter Clem Manning. He is buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Chicago. Later in 1922, another sister would die. Apparently realizing early in life that praying for Dan would be a full-time job, this sister would become a nun in the Society of St. Vincent de Paul in St. Louis. She had risen to become Mother Superior of the order prior to being stricken with paralysis 5 years before her death. Dan O'Leary was one of the true characters of early baseball. Part player, part manager, general manager, and part con man, possibly from time to time by necessity. Hustling Dan would grow to be forgiven and loved by most as Carnation Dan, and admired at the time of his death for his generosity and lifelong friendships with people from all walks of life. I kind of forgave him too, finally. As I said, it took me over 3 years to finish a simple biography. It would have been a lot easier if he had told the truth once in a while, but he always had a good story. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much. Is an interesting character. If you would, before you take your slide down, if you would go back to the game action at the keep going there. Bill Felber asks a question. There appear to be some banners of some sort in the sky above the stadium in the photo. Is that just a printing issue or some sort of actual thing at the stadium? Were they flying anything, or was that?
No, I see what looks like a flag over the grandstand and five
I think he's talking to the left there.
Left.
There's some black dot kind of things. I don't know if that's what he's talking about. Bill, if you. Because it looks too far off to be part of the stadium.
Yeah, I got this from the Lackawanna County Historical Society without any additional information. You see the houses or buildings above the field on the left, and then down below them is some landscape, like it looks scarred. That might have been the comb pile, but I'm not making out any pennants, and I'm not aware of what the pennants would have been if there were some there. Like I said, I got it from the Historical Society, and they provided no other information except it was the field that I was looking for.
Right.
Probably just some kind of printing issue with the photo, but
yeah.
Those may be Chinese balloons.
There you go.
From Beijing, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you mean in like above the mountains there, the dark spots?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That could be just a photo issue. They sent me an electronic copy, and it's just what I got. I didn't see the original photo, so I can't tell if it's a crease or what have you.
Paul, if you take your slides down, hit escape in the upper left-hand corner of your keyboard, and that'll get you out of the
Okay.
full screen. There you go. And then you just go to the upper right-hand corner with the X and click that in the far right-hand corner. And we'll get everybody's gorgeous faces back here. I have a question to start this off on the term hustling. When we think of the term hustling nowadays, it's guys who work hard or are always at the job. Pete Rose was Charlie Hustle and those sort of things. But hustling in the 19th century and on into the 20th, because when you think of Bill Veck's Hustler's Handbook, whatnot, they seem to be the guys who are always trying to raise money for a ball club of some sort.
Yeah, what I've come across.
The term morph, or was it always? I just don't recall seeing hustling and working hard on the field.
Yeah, what I've come across in the 19th century is most of the references I've seen were to guys who had both the positive and negative, indications of the word. That they were hustling, maybe as players on the field, but certainly off the field, trying to keep the teams going, or trying to get a team going, or trying to run a straight con. But they were also kind of hustling, in the less positive sense, and they were trying to take people for whatever they could get for them. And I think a lot of them believed their own nonsense a lot of the times, at least. Like, it's kind of like Ponzi and the Ponzi scheme. He always thought it was going to work if he could just get a big enough group of people to keep the thing going forever. And these guys, I think a lot of them were overly optimistic at best, but they needed money and they were going to get it. And it wasn't always pretty.
Yeah, there were a number of people, and I did Ted Sullivan and John McCloskey and Horace Phillips, and the various guys that were always thinking they could get a ball club up if they could just get somebody to fund them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's where the con came in, because maybe they're good salesmen.
Yeah.
Early in your talk, Peter Mancuso noted that when you're talking about the Indians, Metropolitans being called the Indians, Chief Rossman has got his nickname when he was with the Metropolitans. They were referred to as the Staten Island Indians, and that was the same franchise you're talking about. Bill Velber also commented that there's a comment that you made cited from O'Leary about the Black Sox in the late 1920, and he said Black Sox trial didn't show up, wasn't being held at late 1920, maybe part of the grand jury proceedings.
Yeah, it was at the grand jury room. Apparently he was out in the hall while that was going on. There was people who went, to the courthouse and hung out, especially baseball people. And that's where he made his statement to be picked up by the press. And of course, being a crime reporter, a freelance crime reporter who I guess sold to whoever would take the story, he knew all the press people in Chicago at that time. He had quite a career there, and they liked him.
And our resident expert on the Union Association, Justin McKinney, notes that the Cincinnati Association team was known exclusively as the Cincinnati Unions. The Outlaw Reds nickname is erroneous, although that may have been picked up later after the Union Association folded as something came up.
I came across it as later known as the Outlaw Reds. So I don't know if they just mixed the two together, or they started calling the Union group the Outlaw Reds first, and then they carried it on later on with the AA. But
okay,
it pops up some along the way.
Michael Marsh comments, a very nice presentation. I'm a sucker for stories about old school Chicago baseball players. Apparently, he would have been a candidate for O'Leary to try and raise some money. Uh, let's see, I think the picture you had, we've got a number of folks noting that it looks like the 1886 Scranton team. And there's Eric Miklich commented in the photo in question, it appears an umpire is behind the pitcher. And maybe just somebody in a suit or a hat, I don't know. Are there other questions out there?
I just had one quick comment on the old baseball history in Chicago. The Old Timers Baseball Association, that I referred to it as Dan O'Leary being one of the members. When I was doing the research for this, I managed to get in touch with the guy who was the president at the time of the Old Timers Baseball Association in Chicago. And I asked him if he had possibly had any records of O'Leary and all that. And he said that he didn't, because the previous president, when he lost the election, had disappeared with the records of the association. So apparently Dan's spirit was still alive in Chicago at the Old Timers Baseball Association.
Well,
And
Chicago.
I don't know if they managed to get the thing up and keep it running or not. I didn't do any further checking. So anybody out in Chicago who's looking for them,
That's standard
might still be out
procedure
there.
in Chicago election.
Yeah, I was gonna that Bill. I was gonna think the same thing. Chicago and elections generally means somebody's going to abscond with something. Generally, it belongs to somebody else.
Yeah.
Paul, I didn't want to, I'm not going to debunk you. I'm just simply going to read something from the Guelph Evening Mercury from Guelph, Ontario, April 2, 1874. And what it says there is that O'Leary, late of the Empires of Detroit, passed through Guelph this morning en route for Toronto. The Dauntless Club of that city having engaged him for the season. They will have a strong team in the champions. That was Guelph at the time. Will have to look well to their laurels. So that is the only piece I have that identifies him with being in Ontario, in Canada, in 1874, and of course noting that he played with the Empires of Detroit, of whom I don't know anything.
Yeah, I didn't come across anything that was like a name team before the Cass Club in 1886. So it might have been the Empire were, a team that played for the Gate or something around Detroit in local leagues, or they could have been, an early attempt at a professional team, but I just hadn't come across them.
And the added point to that is Ned Hanlon, the rower, was managed and virtually owned by gamblers. So it wouldn't be surprising that a guy like O'Leary might have got tied up in a syndicate that would have been involved with Hanlon. On the other hand, the only connection to baseball that Hanlon, Hanlan, may really have is that they named an island after him in Toronto and a ballpark, and it was there in 1914 at the Hanlan's Point ballpark that Babe Ruth hit his one and only minor league home run. But that's a real digression from this talk.
A good one.
I was sympathetic when you're Paul, when you're talking about names being similar and research and losing all the O'Learys or whatnot. I remember working with the Sullivans in an area, and it didn't matter what the first name was. There would always be half a dozen of them. I was doing some burial research, and what really got confusing is when you would have a Michael Sullivan who was buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery, because there's 7 of them in Boston, in the Boston metropolitan area. You try to figure out which one it was. Not as bad as Pittsburgh, that has like something like 5 St. Mary's cemeteries, a couple of which are next to or within a couple blocks of each other.
You have to know the St. Mary of. You have to know the of part to know which cemetery you're looking at.
Well, so some of them were diocese cemeteries and some of them were parish cemeteries. And I think they may have separated them in that way.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
He's one of those characters. O'Leary is one of those characters that he's never going to make the books of the major leagues or the big baseballs, but they're the ones that bring so much color to the 19th century, and it's so much fun to go and dig out some things about these fellas who thought they could do anything as long as they had a chance to talk to face with somebody. Thank
Yeah,
you
it
very
was-
much, and we look forward to more of your research. Peter, if you'd like to give us a close now.
Well, first, I just want to say, Paul, that was an excellent presentation. We had a lot of fun
Thank you.
with that. And it's your presentation is the second in a year, actually. This is about a year that we came up with the word hustling because, of course, Bill Ryzak did a presentation on hustling Horace Phillips. And, and I made an actual note of that when you were speaking, because I think we're overdue, anybody out there, for the origins of the word hustling. Because obviously it's a 19th century term, and you can bring it fast forward all the way into the 20th century, like movies like The Hustler with Jackie Gleason and Paul Newman. And, it still has the term today is basically somewhat derogatory. That you're somebody who's hustling somebody. So it's an interesting term if anybody's interested. I want to make mention for a great presentation, Paul.
Thank you.
I want to make mention that about a month ago, Bob and I put out our annual call for abstracts for the following season 5, already 5 years, of the 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series. And it has a deadline of May the 15th. So anyone who's interested in giving a presentation like Paul did tonight, or anything in that realm of 19th century baseball, we're glad to take a look at those abstracts. We're starting to receive them now. So we do have until mid-May, and we want to put together our season and announce it in our July 1st newsletter for what will be the September through May, September 2024 through May 2025, season 5. Secondly, I want to make mention that tonight, right after we sign off here, I'll be putting out our 2-week reminder of our next book club presentation. That's 2 weeks from tonight with Matt Albertson doing a presentation on Outside the Lines of Gilded Age Baseball. And it's book 1, has to deal with alcoholism, fitness, and cheating, 1880s baseball, by Rob Bauer. And thirdly, I want to make mention that a month from now, we'll have a presentation I'm really looking forward to also, is by Eleanor Dugan, who was with Phillips Exeter Academy in Andover. And that's has quite a history itself as a school, going back to at least the early 19th century. And her presentation is on 3 baseball team captains at that school who were clearly barred from playing professional baseball. 2 were African American and 1 was Chinese. So it's a very interesting topic coming from a very interesting perspective. And she works at the school. So we're looking forward to that on April the 9th. So without further ado, thank you again. Thank you again, Paul. And thank you, Bob.
Everyone have a good night, and hope the weather stays warm for you. Good night,
You too.
all.
Good night.
Bye.